The biggest mistake people make is believing they know someone's worth during their worst moment. Those were the words I spoke inside a Dallas courtroom exactly 30 seconds before everything changed. Until then, the room had been operating on a simple assumption. My wife was about to win. The attorneys believed it. The spectators believed it. Even the expression on Olivia Hayes's face suggested she believed it. She sat across from me in a tailored ivory suit, calm and confident, her hands folded neatly on the table beside her attorney. To anyone watching, she looked like a woman preparing to close a difficult chapter and move on with her life. I sat several feet away in a wheelchair beside my attorney, Matthew Reed. Looking back, I cannot blame anyone for making assumptions. Appearances tell powerful stories. Mine certainly did. A once successful businessman whose life had been altered by a devastating accident. A husband whose marriage had collapsed. A man who now relied on a wheelchair and spent more time in rehabilitation centers than boardrooms. The story seemed obvious. At least on the surface. Rain tapped softly against the courthouse windows while Judge Richard Coleman reviewed the final documents before him. Outside, gray clouds hung low over the Dallas skyline. The city looked distant and blurred, almost as though the weather itself wanted to keep the future hidden a little longer. Olivia's attorney had just finished presenting his final argument. It was polished, professional, and entirely predictable. He spoke about fairness. Shared assets. Contributions to the marriage. Financial security moving forward. Every sentence pointed toward the same conclusion. Olivia was entitled to a substantial portion of everything she believed we had built together. The strange thing was that I never interrupted. I never objected. Throughout the entire process, I had remained calm. That confused people. Some interpreted it as weakness. Others interpreted it as resignation. The truth was much simpler. There is a difference between losing and waiting. Most people do not recognize that difference until it is too late. Judge Coleman adjusted his glasses and looked toward me. Mr. Hayes, before the court proceeds, is there anything further you wish to present? The question seemed routine. Ordinary. Yet the moment it left his mouth, I felt every eye in the room turn toward me. For a few seconds, nobody moved. I glanced briefly at Matthew. He gave a small nod. Then I looked back at the judge. Yes, Your Honor, I said calmly. Before you decide, there is one question nobody has asked. Confusion appeared on several faces immediately. Olivia frowned slightly. Her attorney shifted in his seat. Even Judge Coleman paused. And what question is that? He asked. I rested my hands lightly on the armrests of my wheelchair. My voice remained steady. What if everyone has been looking at the wrong story? The silence that followed felt heavier than the room itself. Nobody understood what I meant. That was expected. Looking back, I realized that moment represented something much larger than a legal proceeding. It was the exact point where assumptions were about to collide with reality. Matthew reached down and placed a sealed envelope on the table. He did not open it. He simply set it there. The sound of the envelope touching polished wood seemed louder than it should have. Olivia looked at it. Then at me. For the first time that morning, her confidence appeared slightly unsettled. Only slightly. But enough for me to notice. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Inside, the courtroom remained perfectly still. What nobody knew was that the story they thought had started with an accident had actually started many years earlier, long before the wheelchair, long before the divorce, and long before anyone imagined we would someday sit across from each other in a courtroom. Because the truth was that the most important decision of my life had been made 15 years before Olivia ever decided to leave. Looking back, it is easy to believe success happened faster than it actually did. Memory has a way of compressing years into moments. The truth is that nothing about my journey was quick. 15 years before that courtroom, I owned a small warehouse on the outskirts of Dallas, one aging delivery truck, and a business account that constantly tested my ability to stay optimistic. Most mornings began before sunrise. I unlocked the warehouse doors while the air was still cool and spent the day doing whatever needed to be done. Some days I loaded freight. Some days I handled customer service calls. Other days I drove deliveries myself because hiring another driver simply was not in the budget. There were moments when the entire company felt like it rested on my shoulders alone. Yet strangely enough, those were some of the happiest years of my life. Every new customer felt like a victory. Every signed contract felt like proof that persistence mattered. Around that time, I met Olivia. We were introduced through mutual friends at a neighborhood gathering one Saturday afternoon. I almost did not attend because a shipment issue had delayed my schedule by several hours. By the time I arrived, most people were already talking in small groups across the backyard. Olivia stood near a wooden fence laughing at something one of her friends had said. There was nothing dramatic about the moment. No music playing in the background. No cinematic realization. Just a conversation that felt unexpectedly easy. We talked for nearly an hour that afternoon. Then we talked again the following week. Before long, those conversations became part of my routine. What impressed me most was how interested she seemed in my goals. Most people heard the words small transportation company and immediately changed the subject. Olivia listened. She asked questions. She wanted to know where I thought the business could go. Looking back, that support meant more than I realized at the time. Those early years were simple. We did not have luxury vacations or expensive homes. Date nights usually involved local restaurants, take-out meals, or long drives through Texas back roads while discussing the future. We spent weekends planning goals and talking about possibilities. When business challenges appeared, she encouraged me to keep going. When opportunities emerged, she celebrated them as though they belonged to both of us. Eventually, we got married. The ceremony was small. Family members gathered. Close friends attended. Nobody imagined they were witnessing the beginning of a story that would someday end in a courtroom. At the time, all we saw was the future. The company continued growing. 1 truck became 3. 3 became 10. New contracts arrived. Additional warehouses opened. Employees joined the team. Every year seemed slightly better than the year before. Success did not arrive all at once. It arrived through thousands of small decisions made consistently over time. Through all of it, Olivia remained beside me. Or at least that was how it appeared. Looking back now, I realize that success changes people in subtle ways. Not immediately. Not dramatically. It simply introduces new pressures, new expectations, and new priorities. At first, those changes were almost impossible to notice. A preference here. A new social circle there. More charity events. More business gatherings. More conversations about appearances and public image. None of it seemed important. After all, successful people often live differently than struggling entrepreneurs. I assumed we were simply adapting to a new chapter of life. If there were warning signs, I missed them. Perhaps I did not want to see them. Perhaps I was too focused on growth to pay attention. Whatever the reason, I remained convinced that the foundation beneath our marriage was as strong as ever. Years later, I would discover how wrong that assumption had been. Because while I was busy building a company, life was quietly preparing a test neither of us expected to face. The day everything changed began like hundreds of other days. I woke up before sunrise, reviewed shipment reports over coffee, answered several emails, and prepared for a meeting outside Dallas. There was nothing unusual about the schedule. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that suggested my life was about to divide itself into 2 separate chapters. Before and after. Looking back, that is what stays with me the most. Major turning points rarely announce themselves. They arrive disguised as ordinary days and quietly change everything. At that point, the company was thriving. New contracts were coming in faster than ever. We were discussing expansion into several additional markets across the South. My calendar was full. My future felt predictable. I remember thinking about growth projections during the drive. I remember planning conversations with executives. I remember wondering whether Olivia and I would finally take the vacation we had postponed twice because of work. Then memory becomes fragmented. Certain details remain clear. Others disappear completely. What followed was not a single dramatic moment in my mind. It was a series of disconnected images separated by long stretches of uncertainty. The next thing I clearly remember was opening my eyes in a hospital room. Bright lights reflected from the ceiling. Machines hummed quietly nearby. For several seconds I did not understand where I was. Then I tried to move. Fear does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives as silence. Heavy. Cold. Unwelcome. Doctors spoke carefully. Nurses moved efficiently. Specialists entered and exited the room throughout the day. Every conversation seemed to include the same words. Recovery. Rehabilitation. Patience. Time. Nobody wanted to make promises. Nobody could tell me exactly what the future would look like. The only certainty was that life would not immediately return to normal. Olivia was there when I woke up. She sat beside the bed holding my hand. Her eyes looked tired from lack of sleep. Seeing her there gave me comfort. Whatever challenges waited ahead, I believed we would face them together. For weeks, the hospital became my entire world. Days blended together. Physical therapists introduced exercises that seemed impossible. Progress was measured in inches instead of miles. Tasks I had never thought about suddenly required effort and concentration. Some mornings brought encouragement. Others brought frustration. Yet I refused to surrender. I had spent years building a company through persistence. I approached recovery the same way. One step at a time. One goal at a time. One day at a time. During those early months, Olivia remained supportive. She attended appointments. Spoke with doctors. Updated family members. From the outside, she appeared to be exactly the partner I needed. Looking back, I think that was what made the changes harder to recognize. They arrived slowly. So slowly that I convinced myself they were temporary. At first, it was small things. She spent less time talking about the future. She seemed distracted during conversations. When I discussed rehabilitation goals, her enthusiasm felt forced. I blamed stress. The situation had changed both our lives. Of course she was overwhelmed. Anyone would have been. But the distance continued growing. One afternoon, several months into rehabilitation, I noticed something that stayed with me. I was working through a difficult therapy session inside a bright training room filled with equipment and support rails. Through a glass wall, I could see Olivia standing in the hallway. Most spouses watched closely. They celebrated progress. They offered encouragement. Olivia was looking at her phone. She checked messages repeatedly and barely glanced toward the room. When our eyes met, she smiled. It was polite. Familiar. Yet somehow empty. The smile disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. For reasons I could not explain, that moment unsettled me more than any medical update ever had. Physical recovery was difficult, but it was measurable. Emotional distance was different. You could feel it without being able to prove it existed. Months passed. I continued fighting for every improvement. Meanwhile, something invisible was changing inside my marriage. At the time, I kept telling myself things would get better. Looking back, I realized the signs were already there. The accident had not created new problems. It had simply revealed weaknesses that had been hiding beneath the surface for years. What I did not know then was that the hardest part of my recovery would have nothing to do with learning how to move forward. It would be discovering who was still willing to move forward with me. The first thing to disappear was not affection. It was admiration. Looking back, I think that was the moment everything truly began to unravel. Love can survive difficult circumstances. It can survive disappointment, uncertainty, and fear. Admiration is different. Once it fades, people begin seeing each other through an entirely different lens. About 9 months after the accident, I returned home full-time. Friends congratulated me. Family members said things were improving. Employees from the company stopped by to offer encouragement. From the outside, it probably looked as though life was gradually returning to normal. Inside our marriage, however, normal no longer existed. Olivia and I still lived under the same roof, but we seemed to occupy different worlds. Conversations became shorter. Shared routines disappeared. Even dinner felt different. There were evenings when we sat across from each other for 20 minutes and exchanged fewer than 10 sentences. At first, I blamed myself. Maybe I was too focused on rehabilitation. Maybe my frustration was affecting the atmosphere at home. Maybe I was expecting too much from someone who had also experienced a major life disruption. Those explanations helped me avoid confronting a truth I was not ready to accept. Then came the charity gala. Olivia mentioned it several days in advance. It was a large fundraising event attended by local executives, business owners, and community leaders. Years earlier, we would have attended together. We had spent countless evenings representing the company as a team. This time, she did not ask if I wanted to go. She simply informed me she would be attending alone. Her reasons sounded reasonable. The venue would be crowded. Transportation would be inconvenient. The evening might be physically exhausting for me. I nodded and told her to enjoy herself. What else could I say? The night of the event, I remained at home reviewing company reports while rain tapped softly against the windows. Around 9 o'clock, one of our regional managers sent me a message containing several photographs from the gala. He was proud of the company's presence and wanted me to see how successful the event had been. I opened the images and began scrolling. In photograph after photograph, Olivia appeared smiling beside executives, donors, and social figures. She looked comfortable, confident, perfectly at home. What struck me was not her happiness. I wanted her to be happy. What unsettled me was how completely disconnected that version of her seemed from the woman who returned home every evening. The difference felt impossible to ignore. Over the following months, similar events became more frequent. Charity functions, business dinners, social gatherings. Olivia seemed increasingly drawn toward circles where image and status mattered more than loyalty and commitment. New friendships appeared. New priorities emerged. Every change seemed small by itself. Together, they created a distance neither of us acknowledged. Then one afternoon, everything became impossible to ignore. I had returned home earlier than expected after a rehabilitation appointment. As I entered through the side door, I heard voices coming from the kitchen. Olivia was entertaining 2 friends. They had not heard me arrive. I was not trying to eavesdrop. In fact, I almost announced myself immediately. Then I heard one of them ask a simple question. "How are things going with Brandon?" A long pause followed. The kind of pause that reveals more than words. Then Olivia sighed. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Just enough to communicate exhaustion. What she said next remains burned into my memory. My life stopped the day his did. The kitchen fell silent. One friend looked uncomfortable. The other attempted a sympathetic response. Olivia continued talking. She spoke about missed opportunities. She spoke about feeling trapped. She spoke about how different her future had become from the one she imagined. Every sentence felt heavier than the one before. What hurt most was not the criticism. It was the absence of compassion. She was not describing a husband facing challenges. She was describing an obstacle standing between her and the life she wanted. Quietly, I stepped back into the hallway before anyone noticed me. For several minutes, I sat alone in my office staring through the window at the fading Texas sunlight. The city beyond the glass looked unchanged. My life suddenly did not. Somewhere between the hospital and that afternoon, Olivia had stopped seeing me as the man she once believed in. What I did not know then was that she had already started making plans that would change both of our lives forever. After hearing Olivia's words in that kitchen, something inside me changed. Not all at once. Not dramatically. More like the slow realization that a door had already closed long before I noticed it. For several weeks, I said nothing. I continued attending rehabilitation sessions. I continued managing the company. I continued pretending that our marriage still had a future. Looking back, I think I was grieving something that had not officially ended yet. There is a unique kind of sadness that comes from watching a relationship disappear while both people are still standing in the same room. The strange part was that Olivia seemed almost relieved by the growing distance between us. She spent more evenings away from home. More weekends attending events. More time discussing future plans that no longer seemed to include me. Every conversation felt increasingly transactional. We talked about schedules, appointments, bills, logistics. We rarely talked about us. Then, on a bright Tuesday afternoon nearly a year after the accident, she walked into my home office carrying a large envelope. The moment I saw it, I knew exactly what it contained. Sometimes the future announces itself without saying a word. Olivia placed the envelope carefully on my desk and folded her arms. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Sunlight streamed through the windows behind her, casting long shadows across the floor. The room felt strangely calm. Almost peaceful. I looked down at the documents. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Years of memories reduced to legal language and signatures. I expected to feel anger. I expected heartbreak. Instead, I felt confirmation. The same feeling you experience when a suspicion finally becomes a fact. Olivia began explaining her decision. She spoke about moving forward. She spoke about independence. She spoke about needing a different future. Every sentence sounded rehearsed, as though she had practiced it many times before entering the room. I listened quietly. Then she said the sentence I would never forget. She looked directly at me and said, "I cannot keep carrying deadweight through the rest of my life." The words hung in the air between us. There was no shouting. No dramatic confrontation. Just silence. Somehow that made them hurt even more. I studied her expression. She was waiting for a reaction. An argument. A plea. An emotional response. Instead, I opened the packet and began reading. Confusion immediately appeared on her face. She had prepared for resistance. What she found was acceptance. After several minutes, I signed the acknowledgement forms and slid them back across the desk. Olivia stared at me. "That is it?" she asked. I looked up. What exactly would fighting accomplish? Her expression tightened. She clearly did not understand. The truth was simple. You cannot convince someone to stay once they stop believing in you. Over the following weeks, attorneys became involved. Financial disclosures were requested. Business records were demanded. Asset evaluations arrived almost daily. The divorce process quickly transformed into a detailed examination of everything I owned. Olivia approached it with remarkable confidence. She seemed convinced she already knew how everything would end. Her attorney shared that confidence. Every meeting, every filing, every negotiation carried the same assumption. They believed the outcome was obvious. What fascinated me was how little attention they paid to my behavior. Nobody asked why I remained calm. Nobody questioned why I never argued. Nobody wondered why Matthew Reid appeared completely untroubled by their demands. They interpreted silence as weakness. Looking back, that assumption became their biggest mistake. One afternoon I met Matthew in his downtown office overlooking the Dallas skyline. Traffic moved below us beneath a cloudless Texas sky. He reviewed several legal documents before placing them aside. "They seem very certain," he said. I smiled faintly. "I noticed." Matthew nodded and opened a leather folder resting on the conference table. Inside were documents I had not looked at in years. He glanced toward me. "Good," he said calmly. Because certainty usually disappears the moment people discover they have been asking the wrong questions. For the first time since receiving those divorce papers, I felt completely at peace. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted Olivia to fail. Because I knew something she did not. And sooner or later, the truth was going to walk into that courtroom. The weeks leading up to the court hearing were surprisingly quiet. Most people imagine divorce as a constant series of arguments, negotiations, and emotional confrontations. My experience was very different. The louder the legal process became, the quieter I became. Olivia seemed to interpret that silence as weakness. Looking back, I understand why. Silence often looks like surrender to people who mistake patience for defeat. Every few days another request arrived from her legal team. Financial statements. Property records. Business valuations. Ownership disclosures. The stack of paperwork grew steadily higher. Olivia approached the process with complete confidence. She talked about the future as though it had already been decided. New opportunities. New beginnings. New plans. Every conversation seemed built on the same assumption. She believed she knew exactly what our life together was worth and exactly how the process would end. What fascinated me was how little curiosity anyone seemed to have. Nobody asked why Matthew remained so calm. Nobody wondered why I never appeared worried. They simply assumed they already understood the entire picture. One afternoon I met Matthew Reid in his office overlooking downtown Dallas. The skyline stretched across the horizon beneath a bright Texas sky. Construction cranes moved slowly in the distance while traffic flowed through the streets below. Matthew sat across from me reviewing a thick collection of legal documents. Occasionally he highlighted a section or added a note. The entire process looked remarkably ordinary. That is the funny thing about life-changing decisions. Most of them happen quietly. Matthew eventually closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. "They still have not figured it out," he said. I looked toward the documents. "No," I replied. He smiled faintly. "They are looking at assets. They should be looking at structure." That single word carried years of history. Long before the accident. Long before the divorce. Long before anyone imagined a courtroom would become part of my future. When the company first began experiencing significant growth, I received advice from a mentor I deeply respected. He told me that successful people spend years building wealth and almost no time protecting it. According to him, that was one of the most expensive mistakes entrepreneurs make. I listened. As the business expanded, experienced attorneys and financial advisors helped create long-term structures designed to protect continuity and stability. Ownership interests were organized carefully. Certain holdings were separated. Long-term planning became part of the company's foundation. At the time, those decisions felt routine. Boring even. They were simply responsible business decisions. Nothing more. Meanwhile, Olivia continued moving through the divorce process with growing confidence. Friends encouraged her. Advisors reassured her. Every conversation seemed to reinforce the same belief. The outcome was inevitable. Looking back, certainty became her greatest vulnerability. When people believe they already know the answer, they stop asking questions. One evening I sat alone in my study reviewing rehabilitation schedules and quarterly reports. The house felt quieter than ever. Yet for the first time in many months, I felt something unexpected. Peace. Not because life had become easier. Not because the future was guaranteed. Because the truth no longer depended on anyone's opinion. Facts have a strange quality. They do not care whether people believe them. They simply exist. As the hearing date approached, Olivia became more confident. Matthew became more relaxed. And I found myself thinking less about what I might lose and more about what I had already survived. The accident had tested my body. The divorce had tested my heart. Both experiences taught me the same lesson. Strength is rarely visible when people expect to see it. What none of them realized was that the hearing they viewed as a conclusion was actually about to become a revelation. And when that revelation finally arrived, the entire story would change. The courtroom felt different now. The confidence that had filled the room only minutes earlier had begun to fracture. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just enough for people to notice. Judge Richard Coleman sat quietly reviewing the sealed documents Matthew Reed had placed before him. Olivia remained seated across the room, her posture composed but no longer relaxed. Her attorney leaned forward, studying every movement from the bench as though he could somehow predict what was coming. I remained exactly where I had been from the beginning. Calm. Patient. Silent. Rain continued tapping softly against the courthouse windows overlooking downtown Dallas. The sound seemed louder now. Or maybe everyone was simply paying closer attention. Judge Coleman turned another page. Then another. His expression changed slightly. Nothing dramatic. Just the subtle look of someone discovering information that did not match expectations. Olivia noticed it immediately. So did her attorney. I watched both of them straighten in their seats. Looking back, that was the first moment uncertainty entered the room. The judge adjusted his glasses and continued reading. Several long minutes passed without a single question. No one interrupted. No one spoke. The silence became almost uncomfortable. Finally, Judge Coleman looked up. "Mr. Reed," he said, "these documents indicate that a significant portion of the business interests discussed during these proceedings are held through structures established many years before the marital dispute. Is that correct?" Matthew stood. "Yes, Your Honor. Those structures were established more than 15 years ago." The room became even quieter. Olivia immediately turned toward her attorney. He requested permission to review the documents. The request was granted. What happened next reminded me of watching someone realize they had been solving the wrong problem. At first he read quickly. Then more slowly. Then he began turning pages backward and reviewing sections he had already passed. The confidence that had carried him through months of negotiations began disappearing one paragraph at a time. Olivia leaned closer and whispered a question. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he continued reading. That silence told her everything. For months they had built expectations around assumptions. Assumptions about ownership. Assumptions about value. Assumptions about what belonged inside the marital estate. The documents in front of them revealed a very different reality. Years before any problems existed in my marriage, ownership interests had been organized through legal structures designed for long-term continuity and protection. Everything had been documented. Everything had been properly established. Everything had existed long before anyone imagined a divorce would occur. Judge Coleman reviewed several additional pages before setting the packet down. He folded his hands and looked toward both legal teams. Based upon the documentation submitted, he said carefully, the court will need to reevaluate several assumptions regarding the division of assets. Olivia's expression changed for the first time that day. It was not anger. It was not sadness. It was confusion. Genuine confusion. The kind that appears when reality suddenly refuses to follow the story someone has been telling themselves. She looked toward her attorney again. This time her voice was just loud enough for me to hear. "What does this mean?" she asked. Her attorney hesitated before responding. That hesitation was all the answer she needed. Looking back, I do not think the shock came from the financial implications. I think it came from realizing how little she actually understood about the life we had built together. She had spent years enjoying the success of the company without ever understanding how its foundation worked. Years benefiting from decisions she never asked about. Now those decisions sat in plain view for everyone to see. I did not smile. I did not celebrate. There was no satisfaction in watching another person become disappointed. What I felt was something much simpler. Relief. Relief that facts no longer needed defending. Relief that the truth no longer depended on opinions. Relief that after months of being viewed as weak, broken, and irrelevant, reality had finally spoken for itself. As attorneys quietly discussed revisions and Judge Coleman outlined the next procedural steps, I turned toward the courthouse windows. The rain outside had begun to fade. Thin rays of sunlight were breaking through the clouds above Dallas. For the first time in a very long time, I felt something I had almost forgotten. The future no longer belonged to fear. It belonged to me. People often talk about recovery as though it is a destination. They imagine a finish line somewhere in the distance, a moment when everything suddenly becomes normal again. What I learned is that recovery is not a destination at all. It is a decision you make every day, especially on the days when progress feels invisible. In the months following the courtroom hearing, my life became surprisingly simple. The legal process continued moving toward its conclusion. Meetings became less frequent. The endless requests for documents finally slowed down. For the first time in years, I found myself focusing on something other than survival. I focused on rebuilding. Not just physically. Mentally. Emotionally. Professionally. Every morning began before sunrise. While much of Dallas was still asleep, I was already preparing for rehabilitation. The facility had become familiar by then. The therapists knew my routines. The staff greeted me by name. Large windows overlooked a busy parking lot where people came and went throughout the day. Progress remained slow, but it was real. Some mornings felt encouraging. Others felt frustrating. Yet unlike before, I stopped measuring success by speed. I measured it by consistency. Showing up mattered more than immediate results. One step. Then another. Then another. Eventually those small victories began creating larger ones. At the same time, the company continued growing. Looking back, I think the accident forced me to become a better leader. Before everything happened, I tried to control every detail. Every decision passed through me. Every problem became my responsibility. During recovery, I had no choice but to trust the people around me. To my surprise, they exceeded every expectation. New contracts were signed. Additional distribution centers opened. Regional expansion continued. Revenue increased. The company was stronger than ever. The difference was that I finally understood success was never supposed to depend entirely on one person. One afternoon nearly 8 months after the hearing, I stood inside the rehabilitation center facing a long hallway lined with support rails. My therapist smiled and pointed toward the far end. The distance was only about 30 feet. A year earlier, it might as well have been 30 miles. I took a slow breath and focused ahead. The first movement felt uncertain. The second felt steadier. By the 10th step, something unexpected happened. I stopped thinking about the movement itself. For the first time since the accident, I was simply moving forward. The realization struck harder than I expected. Not because of the physical achievement. Because of what it represented. For so long, I had viewed my life through the lens of loss. What had changed? What had disappeared? What I could no longer do. Standing there in that hallway, I finally recognized something important. My story was not being defined by what happened to me. It was being defined by what I chose to do afterward. Later that evening, I returned to the executive office overlooking downtown Dallas. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the entire wall. The city glowed beneath the warm light of sunset. Traffic moved through the streets below. Construction projects dotted the skyline. The world looked full of possibilities again. Months earlier, I would have stood there thinking about Olivia. About the divorce. About everything that had gone wrong. Now my thoughts moved elsewhere. New goals. New opportunities. New chapters. Surprisingly, I felt no anger toward her. Time has a way of smoothing the sharp edges of disappointment. What remained was clarity. She had made her choices. I had made mine. The difference was that I had stopped living in the past. As the last rays of sunlight reflected across the glass towers surrounding downtown, I allowed myself a rare moment of gratitude. The accident had changed my life. The divorce had changed my life. But neither had ended it. If anything, they had forced me to discover strengths I never knew existed. For years, I thought success was measured by growth, profits, and accomplishments. Standing there above the city, I realized true success was something else entirely. It was the ability to endure hardship without allowing hardship to define you. It was the ability to keep moving forward after people stopped believing in you. And for the first time in a very long while, I felt genuinely excited about what came next. What I did not know was that one final conversation still waited ahead, and that conversation would bring the last piece of closure I never realized I needed. About a year after everything was finalized, I received a message I never expected to see. It arrived on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon while I was reviewing quarterly reports in my office overlooking downtown Dallas. The city stretched beyond the glass beneath a clear Texas sky, and for the first time in years, my life felt stable. Not perfect. Not effortless. Simply stable. The message was short. Olivia wanted to meet. For a long moment, I stared at the screen without responding. Looking back, I realized I felt almost nothing. No anger. No resentment. No excitement. The emotional storm that once surrounded her name had finally passed. Eventually, curiosity won. We agreed to meet at a quiet coffee shop beside a small park near the edge of downtown. When I arrived, she was already there. Time had changed both of us. She looked older, not in appearance but in expression. Life has a way of teaching lessons that leave marks no mirror can reveal. For a few minutes we exchanged polite conversation. Work. Health. Family. The safe topics people choose when they are standing near old wounds. Then the silence arrived. The real reason for the meeting sat between us. Olivia finally looked down at her coffee and admitted she had made mistakes. She admitted that somewhere along the way she had become more focused on appearances than on the people standing beside her. She talked about expectations that never became reality and opportunities that never brought the happiness she imagined. I listened quietly. There was no satisfaction in hearing it. Just understanding. Eventually she looked at me and asked a question that seemed to carry the weight of the past several years. Do you think things could have been different? For a moment I watched people walking through the park outside. Parents pushing strollers. Friends sitting on benches. Ordinary lives moving forward. Then I answered honestly. Maybe, I said. But only if we had been fighting for the same marriage. She nodded slowly. Neither of us argued. Neither of us tried to rewrite history. Some truths become easier to accept once enough time has passed. We sat there a little longer talking about the early years. The warehouse. The long workdays. The dreams we once shared. For a brief moment, it felt like opening an old photograph. Familiar. Meaningful. But no longer alive. When we finally stood to leave, Olivia smiled sadly and thanked me for meeting her. I thanked her for being honest. Then we walked in different directions. There was no dramatic ending. No final confrontation. No grand speech. Just two people accepting the consequences of choices made long ago. Later that evening, I returned to my office and stood beside the window as the sun began setting over Dallas. Golden light reflected across the skyline and stretched toward the horizon. The city looked different than it had on the day I sat in that courtroom. Or maybe I was the one who had changed. The accident taught me resilience. The divorce taught me clarity. Recovery taught me gratitude. Most importantly, the entire experience taught me that a person's value is never determined by their hardest season. Sometimes the people who leave when life becomes difficult reveal more about themselves than they reveal about you. As darkness slowly settled across the city, I realized I no longer thought about what I had lost. I thought about what I had gained. Strength. Perspective. Peace. And those things turned out to be worth far more than I ever imagined. Before this story comes to an end, I would genuinely like to know your thoughts. If you had been in my position, would you have given Olivia another chance, or would you have made the same decision I did? Share your perspective because every experience carries a different lesson. And if stories about resilience, difficult choices, personal growth, and overcoming life's unexpected challenges speak to you, consider subscribing so you can join us for more journeys like this one. Sometimes the most powerful stories begin when everything seems to be falling apart, and sometimes the ending you never wanted becomes the beginning you needed most.